He was just drilling the ground at a construction site when the drill hit metal. A few hours later, the entire site was cordoned off by people without identification marks. What they found under the foundation prompted the FBI to get involved. See how this story ended? Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun rose over the Arizona desert like a flare burning through glass, spreading pale orange light over the half-built foundations of what would one day be a housing complex for veterans. The land was still cool at dawn, the air dry and motionless, the cranes standing like skeletons of forgotten giants. Michael Reed walked the site alone, hard hat under his arm, eyes narrowed against the light. He liked being the first one there, before the noise began, before the engines woke the ground. It was the only time the site belonged to him, and not to the shouting foreman or the ticking clock of the company's deadlines. He'd been in construction for 20 years, long enough to know every sound a machine could make, every smell that came from the dirt. When the desert wind carried dust through his beard, he could taste the iron and the clay, feel the story of the land beneath his boots. It was an old instinct, inherited from his father, who'd once been a builder too, a man who believed that concrete was a kind of truth, something you could stand on when everything else failed. Michael had never told anyone, but when he poured a foundation, he whispered to himself, the way his father used to do, "Make it hold." By 7, the rest of the crew began to arrive. Diesel engines coughed to life, and the silence fractured. The diggers started cutting into the soil, shovels ringing against stone. The company Western Works had secured the project from a government contract, and the pressure was high. They were building fast, cutting costs wherever they could. The land had been cheap, too cheap, Michael thought, but he wasn't paid to ask why. Around noon, the first strange thing happened. One of the excavators shuddered, halted mid-turn, and a dull metallic clang rang out beneath the bucket. The operator, a big guy named Harris, leaned out of the cab. "Hit something hard," he called, "like steel." Michael frowned and waved him to shut down the engine. When the dust cleared, he jumped into the pit. The ground had caved in around the scoop, revealing a smooth, curved surface under the soil. He crouched, brushed away the dirt with his gloved hand, and felt something cold metal, but not like any he'd seen on this site. It wasn't corroded, not even scratched, and the color was strange, a dark silver that shimmered faintly, like graphite in sunlight. "Probably an old tank or pipe," Harris said. "Not shaped like that," Michael muttered. He rapped it with the back of his wrench. The sound that came back was hollow, deep, almost musical. It wasn't solid ground under there. It was space. They dug around the edge carefully. The thing was big, at least 10 feet across, perfectly circular. On one side, Michael spotted something stamped into the metal. 9A. That was it. No manufacturer's name, no bolts, no seams. Just those 2 characters, and an odd geometric pattern beside them. 3 overlapping circles, faintly etched. He radioed it in. An engineer came out later that afternoon, took a few photos, and told him to stop digging in that section. "Old utilities," the man said curtly. "We'll mark it and fill over. Keep the schedule moving." Michael nodded, but something about it gnawed at him. He'd seen plenty of buried junk before. Pipes, drums, even old bomb shelters. But nothing this smooth, this deliberate. That night, as the last of the crew drove away, and the site fell silent again, he stood by the pit with a flashlight. The desert wind had picked up, hissing softly through the rebar. He aimed the beam down at the circle of metal half buried in clay. Dust drifted across it like a shroud. He thought he heard a faint hum when the light touched it, but maybe that was the generator cooling behind him. Still, when he went home that night, he dreamed of steel beneath the sand, of something breathing just under the concrete he'd spent his life pouring. The next day, the pit was filled. Fresh concrete covered the spot, smoothed over like nothing had happened. The company moved on. But 3 days later, the ground near it cracked again. A fissure, narrow but deep, split the surface. When Michael pressed his palm to it, he felt a vibration. Not a tremor. Not the shifting of soil, but something steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat far below. He couldn't let it go. After work, he returned alone. The moon hung low, the site dark except for his flashlight beam cutting through dust. He followed the crack back to where the metal plate had been buried. Kneeling, he scraped at the edge, pulling aside chunks of concrete. Beneath, he found the same smooth surface, intact. The air seeping through the fissure was cold, unnaturally cold for the desert night. He used a crowbar to pry along one seam. There was a soft groan, then a hiss as a thin draft of air escaped. The scent that came up was metallic, sterile, with a faint trace of oil and old stone. He crouched lower, aiming the flashlight. A narrow gap had opened, revealing a vertical shaft lined with steel rungs descending into darkness. Jesus, he whispered. He hesitated. He could call someone. But who? His boss would shut him down. The county inspectors would bury it under red tape. Whatever this was, it wasn't supposed to be found. And that made him want to see it more. He slung the flashlight into his mouth, grabbed the rungs, and began to climb down. The air grew colder with each step, the sound of his boots echoing off the walls. 10 feet. 20. Then the shaft opened into a narrow corridor. The concrete was smooth, the walls reinforced with metal strips. His light caught old cables, rusted pipes, and signs half obscured by dust. He brushed one clean. Sector 9A, maintenance access. The letters were in English and Spanish, printed in military typeface. Beneath it, again, the 3 interlocking circles. He ran his fingers over them. The paint hadn't faded. It was as if no one had been down here long enough for time to matter. He followed the corridor, each step stirring echoes that vanished into blackness. There were rooms branching off, one filled with metal crates, another with broken monitors and control panels. He tried one of the switches on the wall, but nothing happened. The silence was immense, pressing against his ears. At the far end, he found a large schematic bolted to the wall, a network of tunnels extending far beyond the site, spreading outward like roots under the desert. Each branch was labeled Sector 9B, 10C, 11D. He traced them with his fingertip, noticing that the lines went farther than any building plan he'd ever seen. His flashlight flickered, and for a second, he thought he heard something. Faint. Low, like a hum buried in the concrete. It pulsed once, then stopped. He turned back toward the ladder, climbing fast, the chill air biting his skin. When he emerged, the dawn was breaking again. The desert stretched out, silent and empty. He sat on the edge of the pit, breathing hard, staring at the smooth curve of the metal plate below. He didn't know what he'd just found. But one thing was clear. Whatever it wasn't finished sleeping. And as the first trucks of the day arrived, he stood up, wiped the dust from his hands, and forced his voice to steady. "Start on the east foundation," he called. "We're moving the dig." But even as the machines roared to life and drowned the silence, he could still feel it. A faint vibration rising through the soles of his boots, a heartbeat under the ground that refused to stop. The morning after Michael's descent, the construction site looked the same as ever, machines lined up in rows, half-set foundations baking under the desert sun, dust lifting from every step. Yet something in the air had shifted. The crew moved slower, as if unconsciously aware that the ground beneath them was no longer just dirt. The concrete slab that had sealed the pit looked flawless, but Michael could see the faint line where he'd pried it open. He couldn't stop glancing at it, even while giving instructions. The sound of drills and jackhammers now grated against him. He couldn't unhear the low hum that still echoed in his head from the night before. It hadn't been his imagination. He was certain of that. By midday, a white SUV rolled through the site's main gate, raising a trail of dust behind it. 2 men in suits stepped out. They didn't look like inspectors, no badges, no logos, not even clipboards. Just calm, alert eyes, and expressions that gave nothing away. They asked for the foreman, and when they found him, they produced papers stamped with government seals that Michael had never seen before. 10 minutes later, the project was temporarily suspended. No explanations, no questions allowed. The workers were told to go home until further notice. Michael tried to object. He followed the men to their car, asking what suspension meant, who they represented, what department had issued the order. The taller one turned to him and said in an even tone, "Geological inconsistency, nothing more." His voice was polite, but final. Within an hour, the site was emptied. Heavy machinery stood idle under the burning sun. A temporary fence went up. The silence that fell over the land was unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. That night, Michael sat in his pickup, parked on the ridge overlooking the site. From there, he could see the faint glow of lights moving around inside the fenced area. Trucks came and went. People were working, but it wasn't his crew. Around midnight, he saw a large container being unloaded near the section where the pit had been. The men moved fast, efficient, avoiding spotlights. They didn't look like construction workers. They didn't shout. They didn't smoke. Everything about them was disciplined, deliberate. He switched off his headlights and crept closer, moving between piles of concrete blocks until he was near enough to hear faint mechanical sounds. Grinding, drilling, something being cut open. Then came a deeper noise, a pulse through the earth that traveled straight through his chest. He crouched and looked between the blocks. They had reopened the slab. The metal disc gleamed under floodlights, wet with condensation. The air above it shimmered faintly, as if bending the light. From the back of one truck, a hose was lowered into the opening. It was thick, ribbed, the kind used for pumping industrial fluids. Another man operated a control panel. Michael watched a dark substance being drawn up through the tube into a sealed tank. The liquid glistened under the lamps. Thick, almost black, like oil. But it moved differently, sluggishly alive, forming ripples along the hose walls. He could smell it from where he crouched, a metallic tang mixed with something sterile and cold. A noise behind him made him spin around. Someone had dropped a tool. A faint clatter, and immediately all light swung toward the sound. Michael froze, heart hammering. A voice barked an order, sharp and commanding. Footsteps drew closer. He backed away slowly, keeping to the shadows, until he reached the slope beyond the fence. When the shouting died down, he slipped back to his truck, his mind racing. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he searched the internet for Sector 9A, for Genesis Depth, for 3 interlocking circles. Nothing. No results. It was as if those words had never existed. The next day, he went to the county archives. The clerk, a gray-haired man with coffee stains on his shirt, looked at him curiously when Michael asked for building and excavation records from the mid-1980s. "That area," the clerk said. "You sure you want to go digging into that? Whole lot of missing files from that decade." It took 2 hours of searching, but finally he found it. A faded blueprint, yellowed at the edges, with Project Genesis Depth, Phase 2, printed at the top. It wasn't a housing plan. It was something else. The layout showed a network of underground structures radiating beneath the desert. Each section was labeled by code. At the bottom, a signature, R. Reed, Chief Geotechnical Engineer, his father. For a long time, he just stared at the name. He'd known Robert Reed as a man of silence and rules, a man who never brought work home, never explained the long nights or the locked filing cabinet in the garage. When Michael was little, his father used to build models with him, teaching him about weight and balance, about foundations that lasted. But after 1987, something in him changed. He quit government contracts, started drinking, and died of a stroke when Michael was 19. Now the blueprint made sense of the haunted look he remembered in his father's eyes. Michael drove home in a daze. He went to the old toolbox he'd inherited, still sitting in the corner of his small apartment. Inside, beneath a pile of worn-out wrenches, was a metal token he'd never paid much attention to. 3 circles, perfectly interlocked. On the reverse, side-engraved coordinates. He wrote them down and compared them with the project site's map. They matched exactly. He found something else folded in the bottom of the box, a letter, yellowed, the paper thin as skin, his father's handwriting. If they ever come back, don't open what we buried. Some things are meant to stay beneath us. The words chilled him. He looked around his apartment, suddenly aware of the hum of his refrigerator, the faint tremor in the floor from the nearby highway. Every vibration now carried meaning. He poured a drink and tried to think rationally. Maybe it was just a military installation from the Cold War. Maybe toxic waste storage. But the liquid he'd seen being pumped from the pit hadn't been oil. He could still picture how it moved, how it almost pulsed. At dawn, he returned to the site. The fence was still there, the trucks gone. The ground looked newly poured, the concrete smooth and pale. Yet when he crouched and pressed his palm against it, the chill went straight through his hand. Tiny cracks had begun to appear, spidering outward. From one, a thin trace of dark moisture leaked, thick, slow, glistening like tar. He scooped some with a metal sample cup he'd taken from work. By the time he reached his truck, the cup was empty. The substance had evaporated, leaving behind a faint gray residue that shimmered faintly in sunlight. That night, a knock on his door woke him. He opened it to find a man standing under the porch. Light, a tall figure in a gray suit, his hair silver, his eyes steady. He introduced himself as Mr. Decker, Department of Infrastructure. The name sounded invented. "Mr. Reed," the man said smoothly, "you've been asking questions that don't belong to your job description." Michael folded his arms. "I found something buried under my worksite, something your people are suddenly very interested in. That's classified property, sealed decades ago for safety reasons," Decker replied. "You weren't meant to uncover it. And yet, here you are, digging it up again." Decker studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're your father's son. He didn't listen either." Michael's throat went dry. "You knew him?" "I worked with him," Decker said quietly. "He believed in what we were building until he saw what it became. He tried to stop it, but by then it was too late." "What was it?" Michael asked. Decker hesitated. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. Finally, he said, "An attempt to make the Earth itself self-sustaining, a network that could feed power from the planet's own core. Only, it didn't stay under control. It adapted. It grew." "Grew?" Michael echoed. Decker's voice softened, as if speaking to a child. "The ground beneath us is alive in ways you can't imagine. What you call tremors, we call breathing. That's why we sealed it, and why you must leave it alone." He handed Michael a card with a number and walked away, vanishing into the dark. When Michael dialed the number later, a recording said the line was inactive. That night, the ground trembled again. This time it wasn't faint. The lamp on his table swayed. Dishes rattled in the sink. Then came a low hum through the walls, deep, resonant, like machinery waking from a long sleep. His radio turned on by itself, emitting bursts of static between fragments of a voice. "Stabilize conduit, pressure rising, core integrity." The sound cut off with a sharp pop. He went outside. The desert was still, but the horizon shimmered faintly blue. A light, soft and unnatural, flickered from the direction of the sight. It glowed through the dust like lightning beneath the ground, rhythmic and steady. He stood there for a long time, the cool night air wrapping around him, knowing that he should run, that he should forget all of it. But the vibration in the soil beneath his boots was unmistakable now. It wasn't fading. It was increasing regular, alive, pulsing like a drumbeat, buried under layers of rock and concrete. Something was stirring down there, something vast and old, reaching upward toward the surface it had been denied. And as the light flared once more across the horizon, Michael Reed finally understood what his father's warning had meant. The past was not buried. It had only been waiting for someone to come close enough to wake it. For 2 nights after the tremors, Michael barely slept. The glow on the horizon had faded, but its memory clung to him like an afterimage burned into his eyes. He couldn't tell anyone who would believe him. The men in suits had vanished from the site, leaving nothing but silence, as if they'd never been there at all. The company's number was disconnected, and even the city registry listed the project as postponed indefinitely. Still, he knew the work hadn't stopped. Somewhere below the surface they were doing something again, something they had no right to do. On the 3rd morning, Michael drove into town, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He'd made up his mind to talk. The small local newspaper, the Mesa Ledger, had once published exposés on construction fraud and military pollution in the desert. Maybe they'd listen. He found the old editor's name online, Alan Morse. When he walked into the office, the smell of old paper and stale coffee greeted him. Alan, a weary man in his 60s, looked up from behind a cluttered desk. "Can I help you?" Michael hesitated, then dropped a folder onto the desk. Inside were the photos he'd taken in the tunnel, copies of his father's blueprint, and the letter. Alan's brows rose. He leafed through the papers, his frown deepening. "You say you found this under a federal construction site?" "I didn't find it," Michael said quietly. "They did. I just saw it before they covered it up again." Alan exhaled. "This looks serious, if even half of it's true." He stopped mid-sentence, glancing toward the window. "Leave it with me. I'll dig around, make some calls. But be careful, Mr. Reed. The kind of people who build things underground don't like sunlight." 2 days later, when Michael returned to check in, the office was empty. The blinds were drawn, phones off the hook. The neighboring store owner said the reporter had packed up at dawn and driven away, leaving no word. That night, as Michael sat at his kitchen table staring at his father's letter, a familiar hum filled the air. It was deeper now, more insistent, vibrating through the floor and into his bones. Glasses trembled in the cupboard. Then came a faint crack outside, like something shifting beneath the earth. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the yard. The soil underfoot pulsed, not shaking, but swelling, like a slow heartbeat pushing upward. A power line flickered overhead, and for an instant, the night sky turned pale blue. He didn't wait for morning. He filled his backpack with batteries, water, a camera, and his father's token, and drove back to the site. The main gate had fallen, twisted off its hinges. There were no guards now, no signs of life except for tire tracks leading toward the foundation area. When he reached the slab, it was cracked open again. The edges glowed faintly, reflecting light from somewhere below. He descended through the fissure cautiously. The air was thick, humming, almost electric. As he reached the lower passage, he saw that the corridor he'd first entered weeks ago was no longer dark. Dim emergency lights lined the walls, flickering in sequence like a heartbeat. The deeper he went, the louder the vibration grew. Not like machinery, but like something vast moving in rhythm with the earth itself. The floor trembled gently beneath his boots. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. The narrow hall opened into a chamber he hadn't seen before. Here, the walls were covered with panels of rusted metal and glass screens blinking weakly. On one screen, green letters pulsed. Core active. Conduit stable. Michael took a step forward, sweeping his flashlight around. The beam caught rows of crates marked with faded labels. U.S. Department of Infrastructure, 1985, and old oxygen tanks long drained of pressure. There were steel tables overturned, cables snaking across the ground like roots. In the corner, half buried under debris, stood a massive cylindrical structure with pipes running deep into the bedrock. Steam hissed softly from its joints. He climbed onto the platform, brushing away grime until a small plate came into view. The same 3 interlocking circles were engraved on it. Beneath that, a warning etched in worn letters. Authorized personnel only. Project Genesis depth. The hum grew louder, pulsing from somewhere below the reactor. He leaned over the railing and saw faint blue light flickering from vents in the floor. A wave of warmth rose from it, but it wasn't the dry heat of machinery. It felt alive, almost like breath. A door creaked open behind him. He spun around, blinding whoever was there with his flashlight. A man's voice echoed through the chamber. "You shouldn't have come back." Mr. Decker stepped into the light, his gray suit now covered in dust, his calm expression unchanged. "You don't understand what you're standing on." Michael lowered the flashlight slightly. "You said it was sealed. You said it was buried." "It was," Decker replied, "until your company drilled through the containment layer. Now it's awake." "What is it?" Decker looked toward the glowing reactor, his eyes distant. "The Earth's first self-sustaining energy organism. We thought we could control it, feed it heat, water, minerals. But it learned to take more. It doesn't stop. It builds." Michael felt his stomach twist. "You mean it's alive?" "In a sense. Living energy. A network of biological and mechanical systems fused by design. Your father tried to shut it down before it reached critical depth." "My father?" Decker nodded slowly. "He sealed this sector himself. We thought it had gone dormant. But it adapted. The pressure sensors started transmitting again 2 months ago. We came back to contain it. You opened the door faster than we could close it." Michael stepped closer to the control panel. "Then help me shut it down." Decker's face hardened. "There is no shutting it down. We can only redirect it deeper, away from the surface. But we're running out of time." The lights flickered. A deep roar rose from beneath the chamber, shaking the floor so violently that dust poured from the ceiling. Decker stumbled. Sirens began to wail in the tunnels. Across the monitors, red letters replaced the green. "Reactivation in progress. Pressure unstable." Decker grabbed Michael's arm. "Go! Get out of here!" "What about you?" "I made my peace with it years ago," Decker said, his voice barely audible above the growing noise. "If it breaches again, it'll spread. You have to warn them. Tell them it's not gone." Michael turned and ran. The hall behind him was collapsing in bursts. Pipes bursting, steam filling the air, alarms howling like trapped voices. He climbed the ladder 2 rungs at a time. The tunnel shuddered around him, metal groaning. He didn't dare look back. When he reached the surface, a wave of heat rolled over him, pushing him to the ground. The sound that followed wasn't an explosion, but something deeper. A roar that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. He scrambled to his feet. The foundation was splitting open, concrete folding like paper, light spilling out of the cracks, cold, electric blue. For an instant, it looked almost beautiful. Then the ground caved in. A cloud of dust erupted upward, swallowing the stars. When the silence finally returned, the desert looked peaceful again. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and scorched metal. The site was gone, swallowed whole. Days later, news reports called it a geological collapse caused by unstable drilling. No one mentioned the project or the men in suits, or the missing trucks. The company denied responsibility. The government promised to investigate, then said nothing more. Michael sat on a ridge overlooking the ruins. The army had fenced off the area, setting up tents and machinery. But even from a distance, he could feel it, the faint, rhythmic vibration in the soil beneath his boots. He took his father's token from his pocket and turned it over in his hand. The metal was warm. He pressed it to the ground, and for a moment the vibration grew stronger, almost like recognition. The sunset painted the sky in copper and ash. Below, the soldiers packed up, their voices carried faintly by the wind. By nightfall, only silence remained. Yet the earth did not rest. The pulse beneath it continued, slow and steady, as if something deep below was breathing again. He thought of his father's words. Some things are meant to stay beneath us. Maybe that was true once. But now it was too late. Whatever had been sleeping under the desert was awake again, and it was learning, expanding, feeding on pressure, heat, and silence. Michael closed his eyes. The hum rose faintly through the soles of his boots, steady, patient. The planet itself seemed to inhale. He wondered if anyone would ever believe what he'd seen, or if the truth would sink back under layers of sand and secrecy. The wind swept across the plain, and for a moment, the ridge trembled softly, as if the world beneath him was exhaling. Then the vibration faded into stillness. The desert looked calm, ordinary, as if nothing had ever happened. But Michael knew better. The foundations they built on were no longer theirs. And as he walked away, leaving behind the quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, he understood one final truth. They hadn't uncovered a secret buried by man. They had woken something that had been building long before the first brick was ever laid, and it was still building, deeper than any hand could reach. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. New stories are coming soon. Don't miss the next one. Share this video with someone who loves a good mystery.